The scientists. This is the story of four scientists who helped develop the fundamental architecture of what we study today called physics. Aristotle, born 384 BC in Stagira, Greece, and died 322 BC in Chalcis, Greece. Aristotle was the most famous philosopher, scientist, and educator of ancient Greece. He was the son of a physician who personally served the king of Macedonia. At age 17, Aristotle entered the Academy of Plato, where he worked and studied for 20 years until Plato's death. He then became the tutor of young Alexander the Great. 8 years later, Aristotle formed his own school. The aim was to arrange existing knowledge in a system, just as Euclid had done earlier with geometry. Aristotle made careful observations, collected specimens, and gathered together and classified almost all existing knowledge of the physical world. His systematic approach became the method from which European science later arose. After his death, his voluminous notebooks were preserved in caves near his home and were later sold to the library at Alexandria. Scholarly activity came to a stop in most of Europe during the Dark Ages, and many of the works of Aristotle were forgotten and lost. Some of his texts, however, were reintroduced to Europe during the 9th and 10th centuries and were translated into Latin. The Church, the dominant political and cultural force in Western Europe, at first prohibited the works of Aristotle, but soon thereafter the Church accepted them and incorporated them into church doctrine. Next is Nicholas Copernicus, 1473 to 1543. Born February 19th, 1473 in Poland, Copernicus traveled to Italy at the age of 18 to attend college, where he prepared for a career in the church. As part of his education, he studied astrology, reading the stars to learn about future events, because at the time it was felt important for priests and doctors. Astronomy, the motion of heavenly bodies, was an important element of this. Today, astronomy is a recognized science, whereas astrology is not. While attending the University of Bologna, he lived and worked with astronomy professor Domenico Maria de Novara, doing research and helping him make observations of the heavens. When he returned to Poland to take up official duties at Frauenburg, his room in one of the towers surrounding the town boasted an observatory, giving him ample time and opportunity to study the night sky. Copernicus never took orders as a priest, but instead continued to work as a cleric. In Copernicus's lifetime, most believed that Earth held its place at the center of the universe. The sun, the stars, and all of the planets revolved around it. One of the glaring mathematical problems with this model was that the planets, on occasion, would travel backwards across the sky over several nights of observation. Astronomers called this retrograde motion. To account for it, the current model, based on Greek astronomer and mathematician Ptolemy's view, incorporated a number of circles within circles, epicircles, inside of a planet's path. Some planets required as many as 7 circles, creating a cumbersome model many felt was too complicated to have naturally occurred. In 1514, Copernicus distributed a handwritten book to his friends that set out his view of the universe. In it, he proposed that the center of the universe was not Earth, but that the sun lay near it. He also suggested that Earth's rotation accounted for the rise and setting of the sun, the movement of the stars, and that the cycle of seasons was caused by Earth's revolutions around it. Finally, he correctly proposed that Earth's motion through space caused the retrograde motion of the planets across the night sky. Planets sometimes move in the same directions as stars, slowly across the sky from night to night, but sometimes they move in the opposite or retrograde direction. It wasn't until he lay on his deathbed at the age of 70 that Copernicus published his book, De Revolutionibus Orbium Celestium, on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. In it, Copernicus established that the planets orbited the sun rather than the Earth. He laid out his model of the solar system and the path of the planets. Although Copernicus's model changed the layout of the universe, it still had its faults. For one thing, Copernicus held to the classical idea that the planets traveled in perfect circles. It wasn't until the 1600s that Johannes Kepler proposed the orbits were instead ellipses. As such, Copernicus's model featured the same epicycles that marred Ptolemy's work, although there were fewer. Copernicus's idea, published only 2 months before he died, took nearly 100 years to seriously take hold. When Galileo Galilei claimed in 1632 that Earth orbited the sun, building upon the Polish astronomer's work, he found himself under house arrest for committing heresy against the Catholic Church. Despite this, the observations of the universe proved the two men correct in their understanding of the motion of celestial bodies. Today we call the model of the solar system, in which the planets orbit the sun, a heliocentric or Copernican model. Galileo Galilei, 1564 to 1642. Galileo was born in Pisa, Italy, in the same year Shakespeare was born and Michelangelo died. He studied medicine at the University of Pisa and then changed his studies to mathematics. He developed an early interest in motion and was soon at odds with others around him who held to Aristotelian ideas on falling. He left Pisa to teach at the University of Padua and became an advocate of the new theory of the system advanced by Copernicus. Galileo was not the first, but he was one of the first to build a telescope and was the first to direct it to the nighttime sky. He discovered mountains on the moon and the moons of Jupiter. He published his findings in Italian instead of Latin, the standard scholarly language of his time, and because of the recent invention of the printing press, his ideas reached many people. He soon encountered disagreements with the Roman Catholic Church and was warned not to teach and not to adhere to the Copernican views. He restrained himself publicly for 15 years. Thinking he had found a way to present the Copernican views without contradicting church doctrine, Galileo published his observations and conclusions. However, he was brought to trial and was found guilty, and he was forced to renounce his discoveries. By then an old man, broken in health and spirit, he was sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life. Nevertheless, he completed his studies on motion, and his writings were smuggled from Italy and published in Holland. Galileo had damaged his eyes years earlier by looking at the sun through the telescope, which led to blindness at the age of 74. He died 4 years later. René Descartes was born on March 31st, 1596, in Touraine, Kingdom of France, and died 11 February 1650, aged 53, in Stockholm, the Swedish Empire. René Descartes was born in a village near Tours in France in 1596. At the age of 8 years, he entered the Jesuit college La Flèche in Anjou, where he would study classics, logic, and Aristotelian philosophy, as well as mathematics from the books of Clavius. On account of his fragile health, he was allowed the privilege of sleeping until 11 o'clock every morning, a habit he kept for his entire life. Descartes studied at the college until 1612, and despite his Jesuit education, would maintain the importance of separating reason and faith. Descartes went on to obtain a degree in law from Poitiers, then enlisted in the Dutch military. Military service was tradition in his family, and when the 30 Years' War began, he was encouraged to volunteer under the Count de Bucquoy in the Bavarian army. In his leisure time, he studied mathematics, having been influenced by the Dutch mathematician and scientist Beckmann. Descartes dates his first new philosophical ideas and his analytical geometry from 3 dreams that he had while campaigning on the Danube. He saw November 19th, 1619, the date of these dreams, as a landmark moment in his life. It was around 1619 that he may have started Rules for the Direction of Mind, his first major philosophical treatise, which would remain unfinished. This work discusses the proper method for engaging with science and rational theology. From 1620 to 1628, Descartes traveled through Europe, moving from Bohemia to Hungary, Germany, Holland, and France. In 1629, Descartes moved to Holland, where he would live in seclusion for 20 years. During his first 4 years in seclusion, he wrote Le Monde, a thesis on physics defending a heliocentric view of the universe. In the year 1633, Galileo's dialogue was condemned by the Catholic Church, and although Descartes' book was ready, he put off its publication out of concern that his views might, too, be censored. In 1637, Descartes published Optics, Meteorology, and Geometry, a collection of essays. The preface to the collection is titled Discourse on the Method of Rightly Conducting One's Reason and of Seeking Truth, and was written for the most part before 1633. The work from these years forms the basis of some of Descartes' most important contributions to mathematics and physics, including the introduction of what is now known as analytic geometry. Descartes was one of the most influential persons in the scientific revolution. He virtually condensed the range and variety in the world by his well-known phrase, matter in motion. He wrote various books and papers about optics and examined rainbows. He declared there was no vacuum, but supported momentum conservation. Descartes also devised the principle of inertia, a supporter of the wave theory of light and vortex theory for planets. He thought of the universe and the human body as a giant machine. He is also described as the father of analytical geometry. His most significant philosophical position was connected with the mind-body dichotomy. Descartes explained that mind was external to the physical body, into which it entered through the pineal gland. He thought that science is an activity of the observing mind, to perceive an observed objective reality. Using one concise phrase, I think, therefore I am, he changed the whole direction of Western philosophy. Descartes is credited as the first thinker to offer a philosophical framework for the natural sciences. His theological beliefs became controversial at the time and faced direct opposition from the Pope. The theories and treatises of Descartes immensely influenced countless aspects of the physical and scientific world. In 1649, Descartes moved to Stockholm to tutor Queen Christina in philosophy. The Queen desired to begin her studies at 5 a.m., and Descartes was unaccustomed to working at this early hour. The work, combined with the harsh climate, had ill effects on Descartes' health. He died of pneumonia in 1650. Isaac Newton, 1642 to 1727. On Christmas Day in the year 1642, the year that Galileo died, Isaac Newton was born prematurely and barely survived. Newton's birthplace was his mother's farmhouse in Woolsthorpe, England. His father died several months before his birth, and Isaac grew up under the care of his mother and grandmother. As a child, he showed no particular signs of brightness, and at age 14, he was taken out of school to work on his mother's farm. At the farm, when he was 23 and 24 years old, he laid the foundation for the science of physics. Seeing an apple fall to the ground led him to consider the force of gravity extending to the moon and beyond. He formulated the law of universal gravitation. He invented calculus, a very important mathematical tool in science. He extended Galileo's work and developed the three fundamental laws of motion. He also formulated a theory of the nature of light and showed, using prisms, that white light is composed of all colors of the rainbow. It was his experiments with prisms that first made him famous. When the plague subsided, Newton returned to Cambridge and soon established a reputation for himself as a first-rate mathematician. His mathematics teacher resigned in his favor, and Newton was appointed the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics. He held this post for 28 years. In 1672, he was elected to the Royal Society, where he exhibited the world's first reflector telescope. It can still be seen, preserved at the library of the Royal Society in London, with the inscription, "The first reflecting telescope, invented by Sir Isaac Newton and made with his own hands." It wasn't until Newton was 42 that he began to write one of the greatest scientific books ever written, the Principia Mathematica Philosophiae Naturalis. He wrote the work in Latin and completed it in 18 months. It appeared in print in 1687 and wasn't printed in English until 1729, 2 years after his death. When asked how he was able to make so many discoveries, Newton replied that he solved his problems by continually thinking very long and hard about them, and not by sudden insight. At the age of 46, he was elected a member of Parliament. He attended the sessions in Parliament for 2 years and never gave a speech. One day he rose, and the House fell silent to hear the great man. Newton's speech was very brief. He simply requested that a window be closed because of a draft. Although Newton's hair turned gray at 30, it remained full, long, and wavy all his life. Unlike others in his time, he never wore a wig. He was a modest man, although very sensitive to criticism. He never married. He remained healthy in body and mind into old age. At 80, he still had all his teeth. His eyesight and hearing were sharp, and his mind was alert. In his lifetime, he was regarded by his countrymen as the greatest scientist who ever lived. In 1705, he was knighted by Queen Anne. Newton died at the age of 85 and was buried in Westminster Abbey, along with England's kings and heroes. Newton opened up the universe, showing that the same natural laws that act on Earth govern the larger cosmos as well. For humankind, this led to increased humility, but also to hope and inspiration because of the evidence of a rational order. Newton ushered in the age of reason. His ideas and insights truly changed the world and elevated the human condition.